Hello and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and today I'm joined by politics editor Bernard Keane to unpack Australia's commitment to recognise the State of Palestine at the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. Bernard, thanks for being here with me today.
Good to be with you.
So here is where we're at the moment, as of the time of recording. Anthony Albanese announced on Monday, the 11th of August, that the government had decided to recognise the State of Palestine. And this follows the lead of French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron and pressure, I think, from a large section of the Australian public who have been urgently calling for the government to do something for almost 2 years. I'm not quite sure that this is the something that they had in mind, but this is what we now have. This week's decision represents kind of a shift in Labor's position in a certain way. Palestinian recognition has been a part of the Labor policy platform since 2021, but for the past 2 years, Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong have insisted that statehood could only come at the end of a peace process with Israel. However, this week in the announcement, Wong has said that we can't keep waiting for the end of a peace process that has ground to a halt. Bernard, I'm curious to know, in your view, what you think has caused this shift in Labor's position on this issue now, because a lot of the factors that I've seen talked about, things like, the continued indiscriminate attacks of Israel, bombardment of Gaza, the deliberate starvation of Gazans, withholding of aid, settler violence in the West Bank, attempted forced displacement of Palestinians, and even the very large and consistent protests that we've seen in Australia. None of that is new. None of that has popped up in the last weeks or months. So why has this move from Labor come now and not at any other time previous?
I think there's three motivations for the decision. One is, I think there has been a community shift, symbolised by the march on the Harbour Bridge and the volume of people who turned out in wild weather to express their outrage about what was going on and the images that everyone's seen come out of Gaza and the clear recalcitrance of the Israeli government in relation to doing anything to alleviate the sufferings of Gazans, and I'm being very charitable in that particular description. So yes, there has been a community shift, which I think politicians have to react to. We saw that with Chris Minns, the New South Wales Premier, very, very pro-Israel, very hostile to criticism of Israel by his own MPs, and he had to really pull his horns in relation to that when, after he tried to actually stop that march, when the courts allowed it to go ahead, a number of his front benches, a number of his own cabinet ministers actually took part in the march. So he had to adjust his position, and that reflects the kind of pressure that politicians are feeling, particularly on the progressive side of politics. The second factor, I think, has been the growing pressure within the Labor Party itself, within the Parliamentary Labor Party. There's always been a lot of pressure within the Labor Party membership for, that's one of the reasons why there is a party position on recognition of Palestine. But it's always true that the memberships of political parties tend to be more radical than the parliamentary wings of political parties, and that's certainly been the case on Palestine. But I think there's been a growing sense within Labor MPs that it's just not good enough what the government's been doing, and it really needs to do more. And the third, and I think really important element, is the international momentum, which is really down to President Macron and his decision back in July to say that, okay, we've had enough of this. We're going to recognise Palestine because we don't think there is an alternative to doing this. Obviously that decision is very important, but the reasons behind it are equally important, in that what Macron is basically saying is we can't just sit back and wait. If we actually believe in a two-state solution, we've got to do something to actually bring it about, because if we sit back and wait, it's just not going to happen. and the chances of it happening will continue to diminish on the basis of the conditions that the Palestinian Authority had agreed to with him in relation to disarmament and removal of Hamas from power, a demilitarised Palestinian state, and other conditions. He was prepared to have France recognise Palestine, and that was a key moment because it forced Canada and the UK, who had previously exercised a moderating influence, if you want to use that term, on France on that issue. It forced them to shift their position. Keir Starmer, like Anthony Albanese, was under a lot of pressure from his own MPs and his own cabinet ministers saying, Britain's got to do something more. Britain's just remember, the UK is different to Australia in that the UK is actually selling a lot of weapons to Israel. So, and we are not, apart from the F-35 issue. So it's a much more live issue about what the UK does, and obviously it's a member of the UN Security Council, and it's a much bigger international player than we are. But Keir Starmer, I think, faced very similar pressures, and Macron gave him, I think, the kind of prompt to shift the UK's position as well. And once those three countries had shifted, obviously two other members of the Five Eyes, and probably Australia's, apart from Japan, Australia's biggest non-Anglophone friend in France. People forget that France is a Pacific power, and we have a very long border with France, bizarrely, but we do. So what France actually does is important for us, and it's clear that Emmanuel Macron this is Emmanuel Macron's sort of last term. They only get 2 terms now in France, and he's determined to lead as much as possible in his time remaining. And the arrival of Donald Trump has really given him, I think, the impetus and the freedom to restore France, I think, to the kind of leadership role that every French president since de Gaulle has craved. So with those three factors, I think it made it very difficult for Anthony Albanese to continue to adhere to a position of not really doing anything other than harsh language. He had to do something, and then became the question of, well, what do we do? And the first port of call on that, of course, is going to be recognition, because A, it's already Labor's policy, so it wouldn't be a change of policy, and B, it doesn't really require you to do very much compared to other options. So it's a kind of a don't just stand there, do something sort of option in response to a developing political and caucus and international situation that made it difficult to continue just to stand there.
I mean, something that I am seeing a lot of discussion about now is, you're so right in that this is really Macron leading, Australia and other countries following in that lead. But this isn't new for many other member states of the UN. I think it's something like 147 of 193 UN member states already formally recognise the state of Palestine. But for Palestine to have that official member status, full member status at the UN, obviously needs to be approved by the Security Council. The US, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has veto power. They are expected to veto any movements at the coming UN meeting. And so it does seem that it's unlikely to have that material impact, at least in the UN sort of context that we might like it to have. Although it is interesting that, that France and the UK have now shifted in their position, isolating in a diplomatic sense the US and Israel on this particular issue. It is the furthest Australia has moved away from the US and Israel stance on this. So for the Albanese government, are these relationships approaching the point of some sort of critical juncture, or not really? Will they not care about this at all?
Yeah, I think the US and Israel would see everyone else as isolated from them, not them being isolated from everyone else. Yeah, I think, yes, Australia's relations with Israel now are at their lowest ebb for a very long time, beyond my memory. Um, uh, but, I think it's a fair argument to say a lot of that's down to the actions of Israel rather than the actions of Australia. Australia, up until the Albanese government, up until now, has actually been a pretty strong backer of Israel. It has only recently stopped voting against UN resolutions that Israel found distasteful. So our shifts diplomatically have been quite slow, and there has been a very marked reluctance on the part of the Albanese government to actually openly criticise Israel until it just became impossible to maintain credibly a position that there was nothing really seriously going badly wrong on the ground in Gaza, or for that matter, in the West Bank. But Australia's vision, I don't think, will be particularly consequential to Israel. The Israeli government will be more concerned about the position of Europe, but ultimately they've got the security blanket of the United States, and that's all they need. They don't need France or the UK or even Germany, which has been a very, very strong reflexive supporter of Israel ever since the 1950s for understandable reasons. But it is hard to see without a change of government relations between Australia and Israel recovering. Either we have a coalition government which seems to be pretty much pro genocide and pro Netanyahu and happy to let Israel do whatever it wants, or a change of Netanyahu being removed from power. But of course, the problem there is that Netanyahu is only the most moderate of a collection of extremely violently sort of anti-Palestinian political parties within the Knesset. So yes,
it's not one man's mission. That is for sure.
No. With the US, I think it's quite different. Look, here's my cat. Thank you, Monty. Perfectly
Hi,
timed.
Monty.
I think the dynamic between the US and Australia is driven by much more important things than what Australia says about Israel. Australia is an important country for the US for a whole bunch of other reasons that have nothing to do with the Middle East, or only tangentially involve the Middle East. One of which is we host two important communications facilities and surveillance facilities, Pine Gap and Exmouth. We are a forward base for the what a lot of people would like to think is the coming war with China. So we are being literally used as a supply dump for the US in the event of a war with China. And that is new. That has happened under the Albanese government. We have B-52s now stationed at RAAF Tyndall. We are obviously everyone knows about the Marines we host in Darwin. We are the site of regular training exercises involving US forces, basically training to fight China, along with allied forces in the Pacific. So Australia is enormously important for the US in terms of China, and that is not going to change. The Albanese government, contrary to all this sort of stuff you might read in News Corp or hear from the coalition about how it's sort of shockingly Whitlamite in its sort of willingness to depart from the line laid down by the United States. The Albanese government is actually extraordinarily pro-US, and it has integrated us far more into the US military industrial complex than we were, even under Scott Morrison. There is no question about that whatsoever. A string of decisions and commitments and agreements that have been made between the Albanese government and the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Australia has really integrated itself very, very closely into the US military machine. And its value, therefore, is going to remain no matter what we do on peripheral issues like the Middle East. Now, does that mean that the Americans love us and everything's hunky-dory? Certainly not. I mean, it's clear that under the Trump administration, the Americans that want us to spend a lot more on defence, because that money will go to, at least in part, will go to US defence companies, and I think that's probably about as important as the stated reason, which is that we need to have need to be more self-reliant in terms of our capacity to defend ourselves. And there is this sort of weird obsession that Donald Trump has with tariffs and his tariff war with the rest of the planet. But the long and the short of it is the Australia-US relationship is driven by dynamics in which Israel is probably quite peripheral, just because Australia is probably quite peripheral to the whole the whole sort of Middle East issue in a way that European countries aren't, and because our importance in the United States rests on other things.
It's a position that Albanese, that Penny Wong, that many in the government have said at several points over the past couple of years. I find it a difficult one because, on the one hand, Australia is a small country. We're quite periphery to all of this. And so it is frustrating to not see us take a stronger stance if these things really, if the US really doesn't care what we do or say on any of this stuff, why haven't we not made these moves earlier? I mean, I understand the sort of like broader diplomatic context that we've been talking about today, but it does in some ways seems like trying to have it both ways. We're too small for any of this to matter, and so we won't do anything. But then when we dip our toe in the water a little bit and try and go out on a limb and stand for something that is right, it's made out to be like this really big, significant thing. I struggle to pass that sometimes. It's not really a question; it's just my musings.
Oh, look, but Australia is all about having it both ways. I mean, that's our entire strategic approach for the last 30 years has been, and it's been bipartisan. Australia has been committed to integrating its economy into China's economy and relying. China has underpinned our prosperity for the last certainly 25 years, and has been awfully good for Australia in terms of our things like our budget position, in terms of the revenue that we get from iron ore, in terms of our terms of trade. But at the same time, we have we've gone through various stages of remaining a strong US ally. We were the deputy sheriff under John Howard, and although we haven't gone and joined the Americans in invading other countries under Albanese, as I said, we've now got a long record of further integration into the US military under Labor. So we have. We have everyone uses the cliche, and I've done this myself, of walking the tightrope between Washington and Beijing. And Albanese has done that, and probably done it as well as anyone since John Howard, who literally had the President of China and the President of the United States address Parliament one day after the other, just over 20 years ago. So, having it both ways is the way that Australia conducts a lot of its foreign policy. And I think there is and I've written about this, and I still don't know how much of it is intentional, but I think Anthony Albanese is probably not too fussed about, the incessant headlines from News Corp that he's somehow sold out the American alliance. Because he's done anything but that. And he leads a party which is traditionally been a little bit suspicious of the alliance with the United States, despite people like Bob Hawke being, very, very dogged adherents of the US alliance. Paul Keating was anything but a dogged adherent of the US alliance. He was already setting the stage for a kind of a switch to Asia, even when he was treasurer. But Albanese leads a party that has got this history of skepticism about the US alliance. And yet, as I've said, he has done so much to integrate us into the US military. So, he's very cleverly, if it is intentional, getting the best of both worlds. He's perceived as this traditional Labour-style leader, i.e. one who is not happy to dance to the tune of Washington, and yet at the same time, he's made us airstrip one for the coming war against China. So, that's certainly having it both ways, and perhaps quite successfully too.
I mean, I certainly don't think that anybody could watch what Richard Marles has been up to and suggest that this was a government that was, struggling to pal up to the US, because he certainly looks quite happy to be doing all of that lately. But that's probably for another episode for you and I, BK. To come back to this issue of Palestinian recognition, the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network and many other Palestinian advocacy groups have said that this move is meaningless, it's symbolic, nothing material, it's just a fig leaf. The actions they would like to see Australia take: country-level sanctions against Israel, suspension of trade agreements, two-way arms embargoes, and support for bringing those who've been responsible or involved in war crimes to account in the international courts. That's, I think, what people have been talking about when they've been demanding action, rather than this sort of more political, diplomatic move around Palestinian statehood. Can we kind of interpret this recognition act as being a step towards any of that? Do you think there's an appetite for any of that from the government, or is this kind of like the beginning and the end of how much Australia will do?
I don't think there's any appetite whatsoever to do. Well, I don't think there was any appetite even for recognition. It was forced on the government by the sort of circumstances that we talked about earlier. So no, they had no appetite to do anything more. Their appetite is for this whole issue to go away so they can concentrate on domestic politics. People may be offended by this, but there are very few Australians who are going to shift their votes about recognition of Palestine or Middle Eastern issues generally. For a start, people tend to, if you feel really strongly about that, you tend to already have a pretty hard and fast view, and you're probably already voting accordingly. For everyone else, it's a peripheral issue, and there's probably a lot of Australians out there who are thinking, why is he talking about Palestine? Who cares? That's not Australia. And politicians have always got to remember, foreign affairs is not something that most people actually have any interest in. To the extent that they talk about it a lot, voters tend to kind of not like it very much. So no, there's no interest, but the problem that recognition creates is, of course, once you've taken that step, you can't do that step again. So if there continues to be pressure building up within the government and within the electorate in response to, if Netanyahu's, of course, talking now about occupying all of Gaza, and that's going to cause more slaughter, we're obviously not going to see any diminution in the efforts to colonise the West Bank. So we're going to continue to see the kind of drivers of that domestic political pressure continue to work. So the question becomes, what does the government do then? The policy question, of course, is how do you actually influence Israel to stop doing the things that are causing all those images to come out onto our laptops and phones from Gaza? And of course, recognition of Palestine is, whilst it's an unwanted step, is not really going to change much on the ground. The only thing that is going to change much on the ground is sanctioning the Israeli government. That's really only going to work if it's done in a concerted international way. And it's probably not going to work if the US is not involved either. So, if we get together with the Europeans and the Japanese and the Canadians and we all get together and sanction Israel, that will certainly be inconvenient for Israel. But they've got that security blanket of the United States. Nonetheless, so in policy terms, it's a very hard nut to crack. But in political terms, the next steps have to be things like sanctions, Now, the government's already sanctioning individuals within the Israeli government. Maybe the next step is more targeted individual sanctions as a sort of a placeholder against efforts to, or a push to fully sanction Israel. But now that recognition is kind of off the board because we've done it, we have to start thinking about, well, how do we stop those images coming out of Gaza? Other than the Israeli technique of stopping those images coming out of Gaza, which of course is to slaughter,
make sure that there's no one left,
journalists. So, but that all said, I think the criticism of recognition as a fig leaf, etc., it's a little bit harsh because, and look, sure, it's belated, undoubtedly, and they have waited 10 years too long. If you're going to recognise a Palestinian state on the basis that, well, Netanyahu's been busy trying to destroy the possibility of a Palestinian state, so we need to move now before there's no possibility of a state left. Well, you should have done that 10 years ago when it was clear that the Israeli government's agenda was to colonise the West Bank as much as possible, create an apartheid system in the West Bank, and prop up Hamas. That's what Netanyahu was doing, and that's not me saying it. That's the Times of Israel. Prop up Hamas in Gaza so that there was this continued tension between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Both of those things were designed to prevent a viable Palestinian state from ever coming into existence. It's been clear for a decade that that's what Israel's been doing. So the time to really recognise a Palestinian state on that basis was a decade ago, not waiting until now when noses are being rubbed in the fact of a looming non-viable Palestinian state. So in a sense, the response to this is just a fig leaf argument is, well, look, better late than never that we actually try to do something that is going to, always would need to happen if we're going to have a Palestinian state. If you go to Israel and you talk to and Palestine, you talk to Palestinian leaders and you talk to Israelis who are engaged in this space, who are scholars, who are human rights activists, they'll all tell you, look, the core division here is between those who have maintained the fantasy that you can have a two-state solution and, the grim reality, which is that there's never going to be a Palestinian state. Now, clearly Western governments still adhere to the idea that there can be a two-state solution and we can somehow pull a Palestinian state out of this mess. But there are a lot of people on the ground in both Palestine and Israel who think it's too late, that the possibility of a meaningful Palestinian state has been destroyed by Israel. Netanyahu has succeeded in that goal. And if that is the case, if we call that the pessimistic scenario, if the pessimistic scenario is correct, then that really does put a lot of pressure on Western governments to say, well, what do you do now? Because recognition that that whole pathway is may well be closed off, and this of course is all before we get to the basic problem that the United States and Israel are kind of teamed up in this effort to to prevent any of this actually happening, and that doesn't look likely to change. I mean, Trump is obviously mercurial, and he occasionally he criticises Netanyahu. But there does seem to be a concerted effort from Israel and the United States to make sure that a Palestinian state never happens, which deprives Western governments like Australia of the easy option of, well, how do we respond to the images coming out of Gaza?
I mean, what did Penny Wong say about if they don't do it now, there won't be a Palestine left to recognise, or something to that effect, which it was a stunning statement to hear, given, as you say, that this has not been happening over the past 6 months or even 2 years. This is a decades-long project, and to say that quite, right at the end, when there is barely embers left to keep alive, was galling, to be honest. And you have to wonder how much more we could possibly see how much more is to come before something like sanctions might be in play, before, more broad arms embargoes is ever in play, or if the US would ever stop funding the Israeli genocide. I mean, I do think it's important to point out as well that in the US, that is not it's not like the Republicans and the Democrats are any different on this issue either. And this would have been no different if it was Trump or Kamala Harris or anybody else.
Well, what we saw with Joe Biden, every bit as supportive of, occasionally a little bit critical, but every bit as supportive of Netanyahu. So that's not something that changes with their political landscape. That a different election result doesn't get a different result on this issue there. No, absolutely not. And therefore, we come back to the question of, is it worth us teaming up with Europe and the Japanese and maybe the South Koreans and the Canadians and trying to sanction Israel just by ourselves, or is that another gesture? And of course, the problem is, well, if you say, look, sanctions are just a gesture, what do you do after that? Because you're really out of options after that.
Okay, well, we will leave it there for now. Thanks for your time today, Bernard.
No worries.
If you're listening to us on a podcast app, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Cut Through. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. It all helps Crikey grow and gets our independent journalism out to more people. That's all for now. We'll be back next week.